It's the 1970s, a decade that gave birth to legendary acts, both fierce and glamorous, each carving out their own space in music. The world was immersed in the magic of pop and the raw energy of rock and roll. Among the icons, two bands reigned supreme, each representing starkly different sides of the cultural spectrum. ABBA, the Swedish sensation, dominated the charts with their infectious, melodic pop hits that charmed listeners from Stockholm to Sydney. And then there was Kiss, an American hard rock powerhouse, captivating audiences with their theatrical shows, larger-than-life personas, and inimitable black and white face paint. Kiss and ABBA symbolized opposing ends of 70s music culture. Kiss was loud, rebellious, and raw, a symbol of rock and roll's defiance and attitude. ABBA, on the other hand, embodied elegance and precision, with a harmony that soothed and delighted fans worldwide. But while their music might have been worlds apart, an unlikely fascination was brewing behind the scenes. Gene Simmons, the outspoken bassist of Kiss, found himself captivated by one member of ABBA, in particular the mesmerizing Agnetha Faltskog. Gene Simmons was no stranger to adoration. With his infamous reputation as the flamboyant, fearless face of Kiss, he thrived on the attention that followed him. Known for his wild antics on stage, daring costumes, and famously long tongue, he was the epitome of rock and roll's edge. But when he set his eyes on Agnetha Faltskog, there was something altogether different in his gaze. She was no ordinary woman, not a typical fan or a groupie. To Simmons, Agnetha was pure and untouchable, a vision of elegance and poise that held him at a distance, creating a barrier that intrigued him. Agnetha, with her golden hair cascading down her shoulders, had a stage presence that was striking in its restraint. Her voice carried an almost otherworldly quality, delicate yet filled with emotion, capturing the audience without the need for theatrics. Simmons found himself drawn to this calm and understated energy, which stood in stark contrast to the boldness of his usual surroundings. In an industry that was all about making noise, Agnetha was the quiet star who shone just as brightly, her elegance untouched by the chaotic world of rock and fame. In interviews, Simmons openly admitted that Agnetha fascinated him in ways he hadn't expected. He described her as a muse who managed to evoke admiration and respect rather than his usual pursuit of conquest. There was something about the way she carried herself, an elegance that spoke of strength and vulnerability in equal measure. Her presence on stage was effortless, a stark difference from the high-energy performances that Kiss put on night after night. To him, she represented a kind of beauty that didn't need embellishment, and it was this refined simplicity that captivated him. He was a man of excess, yet here was Agnetha, embodying the power of subtlety. It wasn't merely physical attraction, he would explain, but rather a deep respect for the artistry she brought to every song. But Simmons was caught off guard by his fascination. Here he was, known for his rock star confidence, finding himself in awe of someone who hardly seemed to notice him. Agnetha's stage charm was magnetic yet grounded, her voice carrying a sweetness and longing that seemed to reach even the coldest hearts. Kiss, he would say, was a woman who understood her audience and connected with them not by force but by authenticity. For a man used to flaunting his fame, Simmons found himself in a role reversal, drawn to a woman whose allure lay in her quiet mystique and whose power was as unshakable as it was unobtrusive. Simmons, who had always lived by a code of excess, found himself wondering about Agnetha's restraint and discipline. She was dedicated to her craft in a way he hadn't seen before, putting her work before everything else. He admired the sincerity with which she approached her music, knowing full well that, unlike his own world of flashy outfits and wild theatrics, her world was one of precision and grace. It was as if her Swedish roots and the European discipline she represented intrigued him even further. There was a fascination with her way of moving through the world, her calm in the face of the frenzy that surrounded them both. He would later reflect on the elegance and mystery she brought to the stage, saying she didn't need pyrotechnics or elaborate stage setups to capture the audience. Her presence, her voice, and the depth of emotion she conveyed in every song were enough. And Simmons, a man accustomed to the rock life, couldn't help but feel a connection to her artistry, even if it was from a distance. She embodied a beauty and refinement that he rarely encountered, a vision of what fame looked like without the raw edges, the excess, and the chaos he had always known. You've probably heard of those infamous industry parties where music legends crossed paths, lives colliding for a moment in rooms clouded with cigarette smoke, the scent of expensive perfume, and the faint clink of champagne glasses. It was in this glittering atmosphere that fate orchestrated a meeting between two worlds that couldn't be more different: ABBA and Kiss. The year was 1977, and both bands were at the absolute peak of their fame, selling out stadiums and dominating airwaves. On one side, ABBA shone with a European elegance, refined and polished. On the other hand, Kiss roared with wild abandon, brimming with the rebellious energy of American rock. It was a star-studded gala in London, the perfect setting for industry players, reporters, and celebrities to mingle, swap stories, and share drinks. For Gene Simmons, it was the chance he'd been waiting for to meet the Swedish star who had so unexpectedly captivated him, Agnetha Faltskog. He had pictured this moment in his mind, the two of them locked in a charged conversation, his charm sweeping her off her feet, bridging the distance between their vastly different lives. The anticipation simmered as he moved through the crowd, his gaze scanning the room for a glimpse of her golden hair and graceful posture. Finally, as the evening progressed and the drinks flowed, Simmons spotted her across the room. Agnetha was deep in conversation, her attention on her bandmates and a few industry friends. She looked as she always did, composed, elegant, almost ethereal, her face framed by that iconic blonde hair that seemed to glow under the low lights. For a moment, something strange happened. Gene Simmons, the man known for owning every stage he stepped onto, hesitated. It was an unfamiliar feeling, a flicker of self-doubt that he hadn't experienced in years. But true to his rock and roll persona, he quickly brushed off the nerves. He was Gene Simmons, after all, and this was his chance. Simmons took a deep breath, straightened his leather jacket, and approached her with confidence. As he neared, he felt the energy shift, the world around them fading slightly as he introduced himself, his tone smooth yet sincere. He complimented her work, praising her voice and stage presence with genuine admiration. He even leaned in a little closer, his gaze lingering in a way that hinted he was hoping for more than just polite small talk. But the reality was far from his fantasy. If Simmons had hoped for an instant spark, he was in for a disappointment. Agnetha, ever the picture of Scandinavian politeness and professionalism, offered a warm smile and thanked him for his kind words. Her demeanor was friendly, yes, even flattered, but there was an unmistakable distance. To her, this was simply another interaction, another courteous exchange in a night filled with industry talk and polite introductions. She was gracious, but her mind was elsewhere, on her band, on her family back in Sweden, on her children who were her world. Her priorities lay far from the glitz of the rock scene, and mingling with its most notorious figures held little appeal. For Simmons, this polite brush-off was a surprise. He wasn't used to the word no or a lukewarm reception. He'd expected her to be drawn in by his charisma, but Agnetha was a different kind of star, one whose fame was rooted in grace rather than rebellion. In that moment, he realized she wasn't enchanted by his bravado and that their worlds weren't as easily bridged as he'd imagined. She remained polite, never letting the conversation turn awkward, but it was clear that she was keeping him at a professional distance. It was an awkward, humbling moment for Simmons. Here was a woman who, unlike the fans and groupies he was accustomed to, didn't look at him with wide eyes or fascination. Agnetha Faltskog had carved her own path to stardom, and it was one built on discipline, dedication, and a kind of humility foreign to Simmons' chaotic world of rock. To her, fame was something she approached with caution, something she balanced carefully with her personal life and values. She wasn't swept up in the whirlwind of celebrity, and her music wasn't about proving anything to anyone. Simmons, for all his bravado, was left momentarily speechless by this unshakable composure. As their exchange wrapped up, he was left with the unmistakable realization that Agnetha was a woman who wasn't easily won over. She valued her privacy, her family, and her work above all, and no amount of charm would change that. For Simmons, this was an unusual experience, a woman who resisted his magnetic persona, who remained grounded in her own world, unfazed by the larger-than-life rock star standing before her. In the end, their brief encounter left him with a newfound respect for her, albeit tinged with disappointment. Agnetha represented a world beyond his reach, a world where fame didn't consume and where an artist's inner life mattered more than the attention that came from fans and tabloids. And in that single, fleeting moment, Gene Simmons found himself humbled by a woman whose allure lay not in her willingness to be impressed, but in her steadfast commitment to herself and her own path. As their brief exchange wrapped up, Simmons felt the sting of Agnetha's indifference. It was clear to him that she wasn't enchanted by his usual charisma and bravado. Agnetha, focused on her work and maintaining a positive professional image, was careful about her interactions. She had built her success on hard work and diligence, and she wasn't one to get swept up in the chaos of the rock world. Simmons, however, couldn't help but admire her even more for her distance. Her restraint, her poise, all of it added to her allure in his eyes. He respected her focus and felt an even greater fascination with the mystery surrounding her. Here was a woman who, unlike many he'd known, didn't need to rebel or be outrageous to capture attention. Her quiet strength and her dedication to her craft made her unforgettable. For Agnetha, this encounter with Simmons was soon forgotten. Her focus returned to her work with ABBA, to recording new hits, and to her family life. She remained a professional in every sense, moving forward in a world where she had to navigate fame, expectations, and her own boundaries. While ABBA continued to release chart-topping albums, Agnetha became even more of an enigma, choosing her own path amidst the pressures of fame. Gene Simmons, however, continued to speak of her in interviews from time to time, still intrigued by the woman who was different from anyone else in his rock and roll universe. While Simmons may have been drawn to the idea of Agnetha, their worlds never truly intersected. He remained the flamboyant rock star, while she stayed true to her quiet, grounded nature. Their brief encounter would live on as a story, a memory from an era when music, fame, and glamour brought together the most unlikely of people. Today, looking back on the unlikely fascination that Gene Simmons once had for Agnetha Faltskog, fans see it as a reminder of the contrasts that made the 70s such a compelling era in music. Two worlds, rock and pop, chaos and calm, flamboyance and restraint collided for a brief moment, leaving behind a story that captures the unique charm of a time when anything seemed possible. For Simmons, Agnetha remains a symbol of grace and beauty, an artist who, despite the noise of the industry, stayed true to herself. And for Agnetha, Simmons became just another name among many, a reminder of the temptations and distractions she faced but never surrendered to. In the end, their lives continued on separate paths, but this moment, however fleeting, has become a cherished story that captures the allure of two icons who represented entirely different sides of music, fame, and passion.